One West African military leader just drew a line in the sand and warned that crossing it could spark a conflict that reshapes the entire continent. In the span of just weeks, thousands of troops mobilized, modern weapons distributed, and a bold declaration made. Africa will no longer bow to foreign pressure. But the world barely noticed. The Sahel region, that vast, complex borderland stretching across West Africa, has always been a pressure cooker of competing interests. But in recent weeks, something shifted. Something that forced the international community to confront a reality they'd been ignoring. The balance of power in Africa is fundamentally changing. It started with a military move. Chad, a country long considered relatively stable within the chaotic Sahel landscape, allegedly made a calculation. They strengthened military deployments near the borders of Burkina Faso. On paper, this sounds like routine military positioning. In practice, it was a message, a warning, a test of resolve, and the response it triggered would echo far beyond the region's borders. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't hesitate. The military leader of Burkina Faso, a nation that has become the unlikely symbol of African resistance against Western influence, didn't interpret this as a minor border dispute. He saw it for what it was, a potential confrontation with existential stakes. And he moved with the speed and conviction of someone who understands that in geopolitics, hesitation can be fatal. What happened next wasn't subtle. Burkina Faso rapidly reinforced its defenses with a military mobilization that caught regional observers off guard. Troops were repositioned, supply lines were secured, and then the action that revealed the true nature of this confrontation. Modern weapons were distributed across the armed forces. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't posturing for international negotiations. This was preparation for a genuine military scenario. Traore then did something equally significant. He spoke. In a declaration that seemed to bypass all diplomatic protocols, he was explicit about what Burkina Faso would and would not accept. The country would never surrender its sovereignty to foreign influence. It would never bend to regional pressure designed to serve interests other than its own. The message was unambiguous, and it was directed at multiple audiences simultaneously. But here's where the story becomes truly interesting. Because this wasn't just Burkina Faso taking a stand in isolation. This was part of a much larger pattern that most Western observers have fundamentally misunderstood. The bigger picture, a new African awakening. Over the past several years, three nations in the Sahel have been moving in concert, almost as if following a shared script. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, countries that were once considered peripheral to global power dynamics, have begun to challenge the very architecture of influence that has dominated African politics for decades. The narrative they're putting forward is straightforward but revolutionary in its implications. They argue that the post-colonial order, the system where Western nations maintained economic, military, and political control over African resources and policies, is ending. And they're positioning themselves as the vanguard of that transformation. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what they're rejecting. For decades, the Western military and economic presence in the Sahel was presented as benevolent, a stabilizing force against terrorism, a guarantor of development, a protector of regional order. France, in particular, maintained a massive military footprint across the region, operating under the guise of counterterrorism operations. The United States had bases and advisory missions. International financial institutions imposed policy conditions in exchange for loans. But from the perspective of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this system wasn't benevolent. It was extractive. It maintained dependency. It meant that when their governments tried to make decisions in their own interest, they faced pressure, sanctions, or the threat of withdrawal of military support during critical moments. Traore and the leaders of Mali and Niger have decided that this arrangement is no longer acceptable, and they've begun acting on that conviction with remarkable speed and coordination. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, but is absolutely central to understanding this confrontation. The Sahel region sits atop vast reserves of valuable minerals. gold, uranium, rare earth elements, the materials that power modern economies and technologies. For generations, these resources have flowed outward, enriched foreign corporations, and left limited wealth in the hands of local populations. When Traore took power, one of his first moves was to reassert state control over these resources. He renegotiated mining contracts. He demanded higher royalties. He made it clear that Burkina Faso would no longer accept arrangements where foreign companies extracted wealth with minimal benefit to the nation. This wasn't ideology, it was mathematics. A calculation that the current arrangement was unsustainable. But this resource dimension adds a crucial layer to understanding the current tensions. When you control resources that the global economy desperately needs, your leverage in international negotiations increases exponentially. And when you're willing to use that leverage to say no to the Western companies and governments that have profited from your resources, you suddenly become a much more complicated actor in geopolitical equations. The military mobilization near Burkina Faso's borders should be understood in this context. It's not just about territorial disputes or regional power struggles. It's about who gets to decide what happens to the Sahel's wealth. And that's a question that generates far more serious consequences than ordinary border tensions. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room that Western policymakers have been struggling to process. In the vacuum created by African nations rejecting Western military and economic dominance, a new partner has emerged: Russia. The Sahel states have increasingly turned to Russian security cooperation. This isn't accidental, it's strategic. Russia offers something that Western nations have made increasingly conditional: military support without the political strings attached. No demands for democratic reform. No requirements to maintain specific policies. No threats of withdrawal if the government makes decisions that displease Washington or Paris. Russia has supplied the Sahel states with weapons, military advisors, and tactical support. They've also provided economic assistance and positioning themselves as a counterweight to Western economic leverage. From Moscow's perspective, this is a brilliant geopolitical maneuver, extending influence in a strategically important region while simultaneously undermining Western authority. But what's remarkable is how quickly this partnership has deepened. Military cooperation between Burkina Faso and Russian forces has moved beyond advisory roles into more substantial partnerships. The distribution of modern weapons that Traore authorized likely included Russian military hardware. The tactical coordination that enabled the rapid mobilization probably benefited from Russian military expertise. For Western observers accustomed to viewing Africa through the lens of Western dominance, this shift has been jarring. A region that was supposed to remain within the Western sphere of influence is systematically moving toward alternative partnerships. And the speed of this transition has exposed just how fragile Western authority in Africa has become. When Traore made his declaration about never surrendering Burkina Faso's sovereignty, he wasn't making an abstract political statement. He was drawing a literal line, and he was doing it publicly, which meant he was making it impossible for international actors to pretend they hadn't heard it. This matters because one of the tools that Western powers have traditionally used to influence African governments is diplomatic pressure conducted quietly, behind closed doors. A phone call from Paris, a message from Washington, a quiet word about the potential consequences of specific policy choices. This pressure is most effective when it's private, deniable, and allows the recipient government to save face. But Traore's public declaration changed the equation. By speaking so explicitly and so publicly about his refusal to bow to foreign pressure, he was essentially making it impossible for the government to reverse course without appearing to directly contradict his stated position. He was locking Burkina Faso into a confrontational posture, and he was making that confrontation a matter of national pride and honor, which are the kinds of things that don't negotiate away easily. This is sophisticated geopolitical communication. It's not just rhetoric, it's strategy. By making these declarations public and unambiguous, Traore was signaling to potential adversaries that Burkina Faso was serious. He was also signaling to domestic audiences that their government would not be bullied. And he was signaling to potential allies, like Russia, that Burkina Faso was a reliable partner that would honor its commitments regardless of external pressure. What's happening in Burkina Faso isn't isolated. Mali has been moving in a similar direction, rejecting French military presence and deepening Russian partnerships. Niger has been following a comparable trajectory. Together, these three nations are creating a bloc, informal perhaps, but undeniably real, that represents a fundamental challenge to Western authority in one of Africa's most strategically important regions. The Chad mobilization near Burkina Faso's borders should be understood against this backdrop. Some analysts suggest that Chad, which has maintained closer ties to Western countries, was attempting to pressure Burkina Faso to moderate its anti-Western stance. Others argue that the mobilization was designed to test Burkina Faso's resolve and its ability to actually mobilize militarily if confronted. Regardless of the specific motivation, Traoré's response made it clear that Burkina Faso would not be intimidated by military pressure into reversing course on resource control, foreign military presence, or partnership choices. The rapid mobilization, the distribution of weapons, the public declaration, all of it sent an unambiguous message. We have the capability and the will to defend our sovereignty militarily if necessary. To truly understand the significance of what's unfolding in the Sahel, you need to recognize that this isn't ultimately about Burkina Faso versus Chad. It's not even about the Sahel versus Western powers. It's about two fundamentally different visions of what Africa's future should look like. One vision, the one that has dominated for centuries, sees Africa as a supplier of resources to the global economy, with decision-making power concentrated in foreign capitals and international institutions. This vision has produced enormous wealth for foreign investors and corporations while leaving African populations with limited benefit. It has meant that African countries export raw materials and import finished goods, maintaining a relationship of economic subordination. The alternative vision, which Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are beginning to articulate and act upon, sees Africa as a sovereign bloc capable of making independent decisions about its own resources, security, and political alignments. This vision suggests that African nations should control their own wealth, make their own foreign policy choices, and organize security arrangements based on their own interests rather than those of distant powers. These aren't compatible visions. They represent a fundamental conflict about power, resources, and dignity. And as the Sahel states move toward the second vision, they're inevitably creating friction with actors committed to the first. The military dimension. Capability meets will. What makes the current situation particularly significant is that these Sahel states aren't just making theoretical declarations. They're actually building military capacity to back up their political positions. The weapons distribution in Burkina Faso isn't symbolic. It represents a genuine military modernization effort. Combined with Russian military support, this creates a situation where Burkina Faso and its regional allies are no longer military pushovers that can be intimidated by larger or better-equipped neighbors. They have the weapons, the training, and increasingly, the coordination to mount credible military resistance. This changes the calculus for anyone considering military pressure against these states. The cost of any attempted coercion becomes substantially higher. The risk of escalation becomes more serious, and the possibility that a regional conflict could expand into something much larger becomes much more real. Here's where the analysis becomes particularly interesting, because it reveals something about how geopolitical communication works. Western governments and media outlets have largely avoided covering these developments with the seriousness they deserve. The military mobilization in Burkina Faso, the weapons distribution, the confrontational declaration. These haven't generated major news cycles in Western capitals. This silence is itself informative. It suggests that Western policymakers are unsure how to respond to this situation. The old tools, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, military pressure, risk accelerating the very trend they're designed to contain. African nations moving away from Western partnerships, but accepting the new reality. That Africa is restructuring its geopolitical alignments means acknowledging a loss of influence that Western powers have not yet fully processed. Meanwhile, Russia watches and calculates. Each step that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger take away from Western partnerships is a step toward Russian influence. Moscow has positioned itself as the power willing to respect African sovereignty and support African interests. Whether that positioning will hold long-term is uncertain, but in the short term, it's remarkably effective. Here's the scenario that keeps security analysts awake at night. What happens if military tensions continue to escalate? What if the mobilization near Burkina Faso's borders isn't a one-time event, but the beginning of a prolonged standoff? What if regional powers, emboldened by their newfound military capacity and international support, begin testing each other more aggressively? The Sahel region is already unstable. Terrorist groups operate across borders. Communities have complex allegiances. Resources are contested. Now add to that mix a geopolitical confrontation between states backed by different international powers, all of them increasingly invested in the outcomes. The possibility of a wider regional confrontation isn't theoretical. It's a genuine risk that flows logically from the current trajectory. And unlike some geopolitical scenarios that involve distant nations and seem abstract to most observers, a Sahel conflict would have immediate consequences. It would generate refugee flows affecting North Africa and Europe. It would disrupt international trade and resource flows. It would demonstrate to other African nations that challenging Western dominance has real costs, but also real rewards if backed by credible military capability and alternative partnerships. What's fascinating about the narrative that Burkina Faso is promoting is how effectively it taps into deep historical and political currents. The language of sovereignty and independence resonates because it connects to the post-colonial experience, the moment when African nations nominally gained independence, but often found themselves economically and militarily dependent on their former colonizers. Traore is positioning himself as a leader who's finally making that independence real. Not just flag independence, the symbolic sovereignty that Africa achieved in the mid-20th century, but genuine sovereignty, control over resources, control over security decisions, control over political alignments. This is powerful messaging, especially in a region where post-colonial disappointment is widespread. It's also messaging that can spread. If Burkina Faso's confrontational stance generates domestic stability and economic benefits, other African nations will take note. If the military capability to defend against external pressure proves credible, the appeal of similar policies increases. And if international powers like Russia continue to provide support to nations willing to assert their sovereignty, the incentive structure shifts dramatically. What started as a military mobilization in one nation could become a template for regional transformation. And that transformation would represent a fundamental redistribution of geopolitical power away from Western centers and toward a multipolar order where African nations exercise genuine agency. This confrontation in the Sahel matters far beyond the region itself because it's testing something fundamental: whether African nations can actually achieve genuine independence and whether the international system will allow it. For decades, the answer has been effectively no. African governments could make symbolic gestures toward independence, but real autonomy remained beyond reach. Now, for the first time in recent memory, we're watching African nations attempt to establish genuine autonomy, controlling resources, choosing partnerships, and maintaining sovereignty through military deterrence. They're not asking permission from Western capitals. They're not seeking approval from international institutions dominated by Western powers. They're asserting authority and backing it up with capability. If they succeed, it changes the global order, not immediately or dramatically, but fundamentally. It establishes a precedent that other regions can follow. It demonstrates that the era of unchallenged Western dominance in Africa is ending. And it raises the question of whether that dominance can be maintained in other regions. For nations deeply invested in the current order, France, the United States, and the international institutions aligned with them, this represents a genuine threat. not because a conflict in the Sahel directly threatens their security, but because it represents the unraveling of a system that has provided them enormous advantages. The honest truth is that no one knows exactly where this trajectory leads. There are multiple possible futures. In one scenario, the Sahel states continue to assert independence, build military capacity, deepen Russian partnerships, and gradually transform into a region that operates largely outside Western influence. Economic ties might remain, but political and security arrangements shift fundamentally. In another scenario, the costs of confrontation become too high. Isolation bites harder. Economic consequences mount. Military confrontations escalate into something neither side wanted. And the whole confrontational posture collapses, pulling these nations back toward Western partnerships. In a third scenario, the situation becomes protracted, a prolonged standoff where Sahel states maintain their independence, but at tremendous cost, with neither full integration into a Western system nor full emergence as an independent bloc. Tension persists, but doesn't reach the point of major conflict. What's clear is that this isn't a situation that can be frozen indefinitely. Trends are moving in one direction. The military capability of these states is growing. The alternative partnerships, especially with Russia, are deepening. The domestic political commitment to sovereignty is hardening. At some point, this trajectory will reach critical moments where decisions made will determine which of these futures materializes. As you're watching this situation unfold, ask yourself a question. What does genuine African independence actually look like? For a century, that question has mostly been theoretical. African nations had flags and seats at international organizations, but limited agency over the forces shaping their societies. Now in the Sahel, we're watching that question become practical. We're watching military leaders like Traore make decisions based on what they believe serves their nation's interests, not what Western powers prefer. We're watching nations reassert control over their resources. We're watching them build military capacity to back up their political assertions. The outcome of this particular confrontation, whether Burkina Faso and its regional allies successfully navigate the tensions with Chad and other pressures, whether their Russian partnerships hold, whether their military modernization succeeds, will be studied and debated. But the larger pattern is already clear. Africa is restructuring. The old order is fracturing. And the Sahel is ground zero for that transformation. The question isn't whether change is coming. It's how quickly, how violently, and what world emerges on the other side.